So Osman and Toka laid out well the recent moves in the business class's war on working people. As the worldwide austerity plans go into motion, it becomes clearer than ever that the system is incapable of any fundamental change of course. According to the laws of the capitalist system, which demand competitiveness or death, the drive to boost the rate of profit to one necessary for investment in manufacturing to resume, even temporarily, will absolutely be accompanied by attempts to eliminate as much social spending as possible, to drive down wages to sweatshop levels, and to reduce their competition's access to international resources and markets. And we know what that means. That means further expansion of the already gargantuan US military machine into every part of the globe, but especially deeper into the Middle East, Central Asia, Africa, and Asia, with Honduras and Colombia thrown in for good measure. Any hope that we will escape from an ever more cruel capitalist austerity drive, the kind of drive that has reduced Greek workers to barter and Spanish workers to penury, can now be seen as only wishful thinking. Why have we been so far unable to mount an effective fight back? What would an effective fight back really look like? What have we achieved so far? What's missing? What must we do to prepare for a real response? Let's start with what we've achieved so far. All of us in this room likely agree that the bursting forth of the Arab Spring, the rousing responses to Tahrir that echoed from Syntagma Square to the Wisconsin State Capitol, to Occupy Wall Street, to Idle No More, signal that worldwide there is a layer of youth and working people who are ready to fight. Through incredible determination and dramatic and creative action, this minority has shifted the global discussion dramatically, allowing millions of workers and their allies to openly say, no, capitalism is a sick system. It's a kind of theft that thrives on misery and impoverishment. We demand its replacement with something sane and human. Just this change in consciousness that's in the air, in the atmosphere, it's an incredible advance for our movement. It's the prerequisite for any fight back. And dozens of people in this room played a part in that. We didn't all have exactly the same vision of what comes next, but together we took the first step, and we inspired low-income workers from Walmart to fast food workers in New York to take some courage from our work and begin organizing. But what is the general picture that we're facing in the aftermath of our victories? We have to acknowledge that our strategy and tactics were not up to the task. Some hope that the mass mobilizations and occupations would lead to vital new free communities that could exist within the system. And while many of you certainly found new friends in certain kinds of community, no major space free from the brutal loss of capitalism is available to very many people at all. Others of us hope that mass actions and occupations would lead directly to the involvement of large numbers of people in a political project to take independent political action for jobs and social services. But that wasn't in the cards either. While there was a majority sentiment in favor of the broad, humane goals of Occupy, millions in the US did not yet even join. In Europe, on the other hand, we did see millions join, pouring into the streets, and those millions forced the labor misleadership to call out the organized working class in 1- or 2-day strikes of mammoth proportions and potential power. But it made no difference. Still, this austerity drive goes on and greater cuts are implemented. In Egypt, because the goals the goals were not yet clear for these movements, and the organization necessary to displace the capitalist powers in Europe was not yet mounted. In Egypt, at the heart of the global upsurge in response to the austerity drive, the youth and the militant workers discovered that they had not been able to clarify a program of radical social change for the people of Egypt as a whole. Instead, the Muslim Brotherhood, whose economic program is based on the neoliberal agenda and continued loans with strings from the United States, the IMF, and the World Bank, is now running the government. In Greece, the masses that once gathered together in the squares to oppose the EU's economic demands are now divided between those who want a government sympathetic to working classes and those who joined the fascist Golden Dawn to carry out xenophobic attacks on immigrants and socialists. In France, the groups that tried to start a mass anti-capitalist party were divided into factions and more or less crushed by the new social democratic formations that want to implement austerity light. And in the US, the longshore strikers, who were strengthened by Occupy support on the West Coast, were forced to accept a terrible concession contract that's meant to be part of the final destruction of one of the most established trade unions in the US. Despite last year's widespread sympathy for Occupy, in Michigan, the government just dealt a crippling blow to the remnants of what was historically the most powerful labor union in the US, the Auto Workers, a labor union that, because of its militant rank and file, had given dramatic material and political support to the civil rights movement, to the farm workers movement, to the anti-war movement, and so on. So we have to face the facts squarely. We're getting crushed. But fortunately, that is not the end of the story. The truth is that if we look at the history of our class and our struggle with capital, we learn that some of our greatest historical gains came after moments just like this, when one of capitalism's great painful crises seemed to make its ruling classes impervious to our protests. In 1929, the US and international ruling classes were carrying out equally brutal attacks on working people worldwide. In the United States, just a few years before working people finally responded en masse and organized in their millions all of basic industry, steel, coal, auto, and so forth, into giant industrial unions whose presence dramatically changed the relationship of class forces in the US. Just a few years before that, anybody who dared strike was bloodied and blacklisted and driven out of a job. How did the change happen in such a short time? Between 1929 and 1934 and 1936, when millions went into motion, what was going on under the surface? Well, the truth is that the groundwork for the massive organization of millions into fighting units whose potential political independence was laid in the previous decade by people just like you and me. They were small groups of socialists and syndicalists and communists and a variety of tendencies who organized on the job and in the community to build what they called a class struggle left wing. They organized the unemployed into politically independent leagues that supported the workers on strike and in turn were supported by the organized working class. They created these small circles. They educated themselves and their co-workers and the unemployed allies in class struggle politics. And when there was an opening, they engaged in even small openings, small strikes and actions. Now, labor historians point to 3 strikes that served as models, as confidence builders, that turned the tide and gave millions of people the confidence to ignore the labor fakers, to ignore the capitalist party wheeling and dealing that the labor bureaucracy proposed they submit to, and to strike out on their own. Now, one of those strikes was led by the predecessors of socialist action, and it occurred in Minneapolis. And it didn't look all that promising at the beginning. It was a handful of socialists in a small town in the Midwest. Several of them were undocumented immigrants. They were excited to get one of the worst jobs in the city, shoveling coal for distribution. But they organized a series of strikes of those who were just like them. Because they were socialists, they had no faith in the bosses' political parties, no faith in the capitalist courts, no faith in the labor boards, no illusions about what to expect from the bureaucracy, but they had absolute faith in the capacity of regular working people, freed from these reformist influences, to win. And because of that, they did something extraordinary. After years of bloody defeats, they won a victory. They won the confidence of the ranks of Minneapolis, of all the unions, to organize general strikes. They broke the boss's offensive, and it was seen, the whole nation could see that the rank and file could actually win. And even though it was a little industry in a little Midwest city, their ability to win affected the capacity of the entire nation to struggle and to win industrial unionism. And other groups of socialists did the same thing. The auto industry was organized by a united effort of all kinds of socialist organizations, some who had different offices in the same building, but fought together and fought bitterly on other issues, but they collaborated to carry out a united front effort to organize the Flint sit-down strikes and other decisive battles. So the truth is that what we do today can help create the nuclei of future battles that can depose those who rule in the name of profits first. When a strike or a budget battle finally opens, it could be one in Connecticut, it could be one in which a serious few who know the history of our defeats and victories help to create one of those examples, like that Teamster strike, that will free millions from their fear of breaking free of the Democratic Party and the labor bureaucracy. It could be an example that let people know that they do have the power. When a layer of the Connecticut unemployed have finally decided to march for jobs or to keep their housing, enough activists with a clear strategy of political independence could make the difference between a struggle defeated and a struggle that will be copied from state to state. When 10 million immigrant workers rise again, a serious leader around comprehensive immigration reform, a serious leadership that's willing to fight for legalization now, and to come out clearly against biometric data nets, private prisons, and drone surveillance could make the difference for the whole country. And our goal is not Roosevelt, it's not the New Deal. When Franklin Roosevelt presided over concessions won by the millions on the picket line, he also continued along the path of the capitalist logic of competition, joining the world's other major capitalist nations in a bloodbath where working people in uniform died for one more redivision of the colonial world's spoils. We're not interested in that solution to this economic crisis. We're interested in a socialist world where war, blood, and the immiseration of the competitive system of capitalism is done with once and for all. So we're determined to be part of a process of consolidating those leaders, those activists, those small groups. We want to build an organization of people who have confidence in that future, who are willing to take the time to educate themselves about working class history, to prepare the fight for that future, and to take responsibility for that future. That means that we use whatever resources we have nationally to create united fronts that bring as many organizations together as possible in action in every movement for social change, in the immigration movement, in strike support, against the cutbacks, in the fight against foreclosures, in defense of women's and LGBT rights, against imperialist war, and to defend civil liberties. And it means that we fight like the devil to keep these united fronts independent of the Democratic and Republican parties, to make these united fronts the places where working people will learn their own power, their own capacity to transform society. And it means that as the corporate offensive continues and and as the class polarization deepens, we try to win working people to use that power to create their own political party and wrest control from the parties of big business once and for all, replacing it with a socialist government. And it finally means that we strive to defend our co-thinkers who are trying to do the same thing all over the world. In Pakistan, in South Africa, in Greece, in Egypt. Socialism can only exist as a global system, and that means that we are internationalists first. So of course, the whole point of this is that my part of this talk is that if you want to be part of this kind of work, the absolutely serious work of preparing to be sure that our class is not bamboozled or fatally bloodied, but instead that it's shaped into a fighting instrument capable of taking on the power in the interests of the majority, please consider joining us.